Excellent. Go, 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 Alistair. That means we can actually maybe actually start this thing, which would be nice. Jack, are you doing okay? You've been just sitting and listening to me ramble.
Hi, Brooks.
Hello. That's it? That's all you got for me?
Lovely weather we're having, Brooks.
Why is my mic picking this up? Very frustrating. Let's see. Very frustrating indeed. This stupid goddamn thing. Jack, if you could talk real quick just for me so I can see if it's echoing.
Yeah, you guys are talking about math. I've got a question for you.
Oh, no.
What's mass times acceleration?
What's the pun?
It's a serious question. What's mass times acceleration?
Force?
The force.
Oh, for fuck's sake. See, he's making a Star Wars joke to fuck with me.
I know what you're talking about.
I fucking know. Dude, I'm not stupid. I know exactly what's happening. I'm pretty stupid because I didn't see that coming. I don't know why.
Cluelessness confirmed. Thank you.
Good Lord. All right. Well, we are, in theory, going to be doing Anti-Oedipus today. We got a couple people in here. This will be nice. It's a good read today. This is going over some Nietzsche. A mouse and even Bataille in just one paragraph, which is, you know, nothing small. Why not? Why not just dive in? Yeah. Well, I'll kick it off and say hello and thank you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We are in chapters 3.5 as we work through the territorial machine, finally getting into how the socius of the earth operates, how subjectivity is produced, how repression happens and is acted upon, and how debt ultimately becomes created in exchange, not as an exchange, but as a debt. It is its own complicated nightmare system, as it will continue to be, sort of as we go on and on and on. Anyone want to kick us off with a question before I just dive in and begin reading? Anyone want to do we come back around and talk about sort of an intro to this before we move forward? Probably it would be a good idea, actually. I could see that being not a terrible idea for sure. Yeah.
My KVM's acting up as usual. I guess to kind of recap some of what we went over last week, right?
Yep.
So like with the theater of cruelty, like the kind of position we were poised in was basically we were thinking about how this pertains to the second synthesis and starting to think about how it pertains to the third synthesis. For instance, later on we were discussing like the eye might be a celibate machine, right?
Thinking
Because
about how this
especially as we're dealing with the territoriality, right? We're starting to deal with concerns like territorialization, but also subjectivity, voluptus, and those kind of intensities, right? And that's going to be a big part of this section, like and each of the three socii. Subjectivity, voluptus. Basically, where that kind of dovetails into where we're at right now, right? Is that Deleuze and Guattari laid out what they call the theater of cruelty to explain how, within the kind of use of language, for lack of a better term, right, or kind of semiotics and broad, they're basically arguing that the voice and the written grapheme, I guess is the word they're going with. The voice and the grapheme have a certain independence in the primitive, similar to the use of the disjunction for the affiliative and the alliant. That dovetails with a third part of it's almost like a structure, but a third part of this kind of trinity which is going to be the eye, right? And that's what we were thinking about, is the eye like the celibate machine, kind of taking those intensities and radiating them out for subjectivity. Um, and obviously, that's where we're kind of picking up today, is more about basically how that theater of cruelty functions. Since obviously, not only is it affecting those two syntheses, but it's going to, like we talked about, right? Signs are going to leave the chains and objects are going to leave the connections and kind of trade lanes. So we're going to impact that first connective synthesis as well.
Is my microphone activating for you guys? Are you hearing stuff?
I am now.
Like the last few seconds. Because it says I'm transmitting and I have no idea why.
I'm hearing you now.
Right, but otherwise is it silent? Like if you look at my guy, he'll be spinning and it's green. Are you hearing anything in between me talking? Like stopping now? Is there sound after this?
No, I'm not hearing sound.
It's just so weird.
I see what you mean. It might be like breath or something.
It's not. It's fucking, I hate Discord so much sometimes. Very frustrating.
Picking up your thought waves, man.
Yeah, there we go. No, we'll just do that. That's fine. What a weird thing. All right. I think that's a fair intro, so we'll just sort of dive forward then. The great book of modern ethnology is not so much Mauss's The Gift as Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. At least, it should be. For the genealogy, the second essay, is an attempt and a success without equal at interpreting primitive economy in terms of debt in the debtor-creditor relationship by eliminating every consideration of exchange or interest à l'anglaise. And if they are eliminated from psychology, it is not in order to place them in a structure. Nietzsche has only a meager set of tools at his disposal, some ancient Germanic law, a little Hindu law. But he does not hesitate, as does Mauss, between exchange and debt. George Bataille, motivated by a Nietzschean inspiration, will not hesitate either. The fundamental problem of the primitive socius, which is the problem of inscription, of coding, of marking, has never been raised in such an incisive fashion. Man must constitute himself through the repression of the intense germinal influx, the great biocosmic memory that threatens to deluge every attempt at collectivity. But at the same time, how is a new memory to be created for man? A collective memory of the spoken word and of alliances that declines the alliances with the extended filiations, that endows him with faculties of resonance and retention, of selection and detachment, and that affects in this way the coding of the flows of desire. As a condition of the socius, the answer is simple. It is debt, open, mobile, and finite blocks of debt. This extraordinary composite of the speaking voice, the marked body, and the enjoying eye. All the stupidity and the arbitrariness of the laws, all the pain of the initiations, the whole perverse apparatus of repression and education, the red-hot irons and the atrocious procedures have only this meaning: to breed man, to mark him in his flesh, to render him capable of alliance, to form him within the debtor-creditor relation, which on both sides turns out to be a matter of memory, a memory straining toward the future. The to breed man is a dresser le homme in French. Nietzsche's will to power. He talks about this as that's the reference to breed man, to form and make man. The term to breed is pretty particular here, as we'll talk about. It's a reason the section's called, the book is called The Genealogy of Morals, and it's why they're using this term here, the filiative, etc. We'll get through all these terms. It's a lot at once, but it's a nice way to sort of open this up. Before I begin a ramble, does anyone here want to start us off and sort of kick off what that means? if anyone has a thing, a question, a thing that they're like, hey, can you focus on this? Can you talk to me about Nietzsche's genealogy of morals a little bit, which we can. Can you tell me a little bit more about what Bataille did? Any of those things, we're free to before I dive in. Once I dive in, it's just going to be a lot. So I'll leave it open for a second awkwardly, as I always do.
Okay, how was Bataille motivated by Nietzsche?
It's basically, he's like Nietzsche take two. I mean, everything he did was motivated by Nietzsche. He took a lot of what Nietzsche did and sort of ran with it in a very different context. Bataille, French patent office, sort of semi-bougie guy, but in very particular circles. With, I think Mauss, he was actually friends with a couple of these people. Like, they were very close. I'm trying to remember who it was who, he actually like read their epitaph. Like, it's some extraordinary stories of how these people sort of knew each other. But Bataille specifically, for him, he never saw like exchange as being an operative thing. If you go through and you read The Accursed Share, it's a significant book structure, but really the first section is really what they're focusing on here. For Bataille, the idea of sort of not exchange, but instead debts and how exchange operates, that there is no such thing as a closed system. He talked about a general economy, which you've already heard them reference a couple times. There's a lot of stuff that Bataille came up with that he flat out did not mess around with the idea of this sort of balanced system of exchange, which Strauss and sort of neoconservatives and neoliberals really, really like the idea of. That there was at some point balance, but there is not anymore. They've done away with that.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's definitely not the case. I could go much deeper, but it would end up becoming like a Bataille reading rather than this. So, but
Yeah.
his book on Nietzsche is, oh, well, there, see, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Jack. His book on Nietzsche really would explain it better. So there you go.
Okay, thank you.
The book's actually called On Nietzsche. It's not his book on Nietzsche, even though it is his book. That makes it confusing, but its actual title is On Nietzsche.
It's Gnosis Papadopoulos, my friend.
There you go. Yeah, I'm not ever going to call you whatever you call yourself.
So I have a question about the relating debt, this idea of debt to repression, to the repression by the alliance. Can you elaborate that a little bit? You know, why is debt such an important element in this kind of socialist alliance repressive force?
Yeah. Why do you work
society?
with other people? That would be like, we can just sort of ask that question, is like, why would you ever work with someone else? The exchanges view is because you need to in order to get stuff, which is kind of a weird presumptive thing. You can do a lot of stuff yourself. Ted Kaczynski did a whole bunch of things from a cabin very much alone. You can do stuff. So it's a question of like, how do you get people or kind of build people or breed people to the point where they're not, as they use the term here, where they're not sort of dealing directly with the intense germinal influx, this desire that they could very well consume themselves, this sort of instant consumption of their own needs instantly. How do you build a man that will deal with a social situation? And it's not an exchange. You do that with debt. You do that with early on teaching them their debt to society in various ways. Then if I'm indebted to you, or if I'm indebted to a larger group, I'm going to do stuff for you. It'll change my relationship socially. And this is, as they've kind of been bringing up, I'm very much oversimplifying the chapter so far, but this is the challenge with an exchangist conception is if everything is balanced, oh, I actually need chickens over there. Well, why don't I just take a chicken? Like, why don't I just do that? Well, we can't let people just consume their desires instantly. Why don't I just, oh, I have a chicken here. Why don't I just eat it instead of waiting for eggs? Oh, I have a daughter here. Why don't I just fuck her instead of having her work with other people? Like, I have these things. How do you teach people to repress that instant sort of consumption that's direct and instead have this collectivity that sort of can exist beyond this. And that's what they're focusing on here. And the way that they phrase it, how is a new memory to be created for man? A collective memory of a spoken word and of alliances that declines the alliance. That's a weird translation. What's the original? One sec. I want to go 2 seconds. Sorry. A collective memory. Yeah, they do it. That declines. It's such a weird phrasing because I don't think we use it like this in English. The idea being that like it crosses over the XY coordinates on a graph kind of thing. That merges with that declines alliances with extended affiliations, which endows it with faculties of resonance and retention, collection and detachement, and thus operates the coding of the flux of desire as a condition of society. The coding itself is the conditioning of society. It is what makes society possible. This is that setup. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think the next paragraph where it says that debt is the direct result of inscription. Yeah, so that means that in order to fulfill your desires, you have to go through the symbolic order. Yeah, and so it's all inscribed by language and symbols and so forth and signs.
Yeah, the memory, it's the making a memory, the breeding of man, that they use that phrase, which is really, it's a great one, marking him in his flesh, making him capable of alliances, forming him in the relationship of creditor-debtor, not one or the other, but both. He's on both sides. It's this nature of memory. It's the phrasing they use, form him which on both sides turns out to be a matter of memory, a memory straining toward a future. I really like the phrasing of that. Yeah, I mean, they kind of are saying a lot more in this. It's that last bit. All the stupidity and the arbitrariness of the laws, all the pain of initiations, the whole perverse repression in education, red hot iron, atrocious procedures, only have one meaning. It's to breed man, to just say, it's an interesting phrasing. You could say to train, to breed man's probably wrong because that implies that you're like literally, it's like you're breeding man like you breed dogs. The phrasing and the use of that is much more breeding like the way that you raise or train cattle or horses or dogs, but it's about the sort of building of it into them, the way that you train them, the way that you set them up. It literally means to draw up, to set in that position. So it's a different sort of thing. I don't know if that helps, but it's shaping someone, shaping man to this, through this thing. That's all they do. It marks him in his flesh. It renders him capable of alliance in the first place.
How does the body without organs play into this? Because it is doing the recording also, isn't it?
Oh yeah, we'll get into that. Don't worry. I'm just going to say that is later. We're like later in this, I think it's going to be later in this reading even, that he's going to say pretty specifically. But yes, it is the surface of recording. How's everyone else doing on this one? Is everyone else doing okay?
In Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, he talks about the priestly class. Are they the ones that are like the play a major role in the recording of memory and so forth?
Priestly class is going to come a little bit later in this. They're mostly referencing here the second essay, which is about guilt. guilt, bad conscience, and related matters. I need to pull that up. It's playing with this idea of what is guilt and where does it begin. For him, it goes all the way back to this idea that like originally we took punishments as forms of compensation, where someone needed like he uses some very specific examples, which I'm not sure are totally historical in and of themselves. So I'm hesitant to sort of bring them up, but the idea of making someone pay, that phrase, think about the use of that. When someone's saying, oh my God, he pissed me off, I'm going to make him pay, is actually what Nietzsche is discussing, because that's not like an idiom in English. That's something that is almost global and constant. And so there's this thing of making someone pay as a form of sort of guilt assuaging or meting out justice or extracting a debt someone owes you, making them pay. This thing then sort of gave us the originating, paying one's debts to society in prison, paying, there's a lot of paying it back by being enslaved. The idea of debt as sort of the base of this. With that, we then have the role of justice, which was first used in sort of these sort of who owes what way. If you go back to like, Hammurabi and all these original codes of laws, this is where Nietzsche is playing. And the social structures that sort of play into this or become formed around this are ultimately internalized human aggression and demand for justice. And this is the sort of play that he makes. They're taking it a different slight direction, but the base of it, where he's like it's about the origin of guilt and debt. This is absolutely where they're taking it. And so that's why they're using Nietzsche here, Mauss, who did very much the same play, and Bataille, who ran with it on Nietzsche, for sure. Is that a fair way to put it, Jack?
What was the question?
Yeah. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, what was the original question, though?
Talking about through Nietzsche, how Nietzsche comes to play in this. And the original question was about the priest class. I don't think we're not quite there yet, because they come out as the village perverts inside of the despotic, I believe.
Yeah, I would just say it's more about the socius than any individual group, or class of society.
Does this make sense to everyone so far? Because it's kind of it's going to continue. I'm as always, they cut halfway through a paragraph in the French, so this is only half of a thought. We're getting through the rest of it. Arachne says it's not only debt. Being forced to pay the police state, for example, is solely the moral production of justice and the ascription of moral sense in tribes. This is what they're discussing. This is the play they're making when they say, how is a new memory to be created for man, a collective memory of the spoken word and of alliances that declines the alliances. It works them together with the extended filiations, that endows him with faculties of resonance and retention, of selection and detachment. This is again through the synthesis, selection, detachment, and that affects his way of coding of the flux of desire as a conditioning of the socius. It is debt. That is it. Open, mobile, and finite. And those are going to be really three important things: open, mobile, and finite, as we get through here. And we'll just get to the next paragraph because I think it works pretty quick.
Before we do, there's a couple of points.
Go for it.
Tease out. Okay. Okay, so this paragraph is basically, it's building on like the argument they've been making about like debtor and creditor relationships, right? So the basic point is they're kind of moving back to the second synthesis here, because that's like this language of inscription, this language of memory, right? That's basically second synthesis language, right? Especially as they start getting into the alignment affiliative. So just to pick out a couple passages, the fundamental problem of the primitive socios, which is the problem of inscription, of coding, marking, has never been raised in such an incisive fashion. And then this is the part that I think is important. Man must constitute himself through the repression of the intense germinal influx, the great biocosmic memory that threatens to deluge every attempt at collectivity, right? So like submerge, right? Overwhelm. So like if you recall from the fourth paralogism, right, that's the target for repression. That's what actually gets repressed, or the language they use is what the repression bears upon is the germinal influx, because it's standing in for the decoded flows, the non-coded flows, right? And in a sense, some, the implication being some of the flows on the BWO, right? So notice that that's being brought forward as with that kind of subtext to it, or that context to it, even as part of how man is produced, right? Because even though this is not necessarily anthropocentric, at the same time, there's a part of this in which, like, when I read germinal influx, I'm thinking about just kind of like how life produces itself, right? Very generally speaking. And in that sense, right, the repression of that life producing itself, even though it's an open system, is being connected here with how people, um, in a general sense, right, how people are being constituted, or, they use the language of breeding, right? The actual have this sense of debt tied to that, so that on one hand, the production itself is actually being repressed by the Alliant, right? And on the other hand, that process is also full. And as they kind of allude to at this very last sentence, right, kind of hobbling them toward the future, right? Which in like it's a kind of joke on Nietzsche, right? Because Nietzsche is about the future kind of coming, arriving, right? I have come too soon, says the madman. In this sense, right, the present is kind of hobbled as though it kind of limps toward the future, right? Um, one more part I wanted to focus on before we move on. I'm trying to go quick for the sake of time. But at the same time, this is right where I left off, but at the same time, how is a new memory to be created for man? A collective memory of the spoken word and of alliances that declines the alliances with the extended filiations, that endows him with faculties of resonance and retention, of selection and detachment, and that effect, in this way, the coding of the flows of desire as a condition of the socius. Right? So how does production affect itself to work at this kind of repressive way? The answer is simple. It is debt, open, mobile, and finite lots of debt. This extraordinary composite of the speaking voice, the marked body, and the enjoying eye, so the theater of cruelty. All the stupidity and the arbitrariness of the laws, the pain of the initiations, the whole perverse apparatus of repression, education, so forth, to breed man. Right, I'm not going to finish the sentence because we get the idea. The important thing there is notice that in the problem I was describing, that on one hand, right, the germinal influx as this kind of production of life upon the socius, right, standing in for the decoded flows, and by implication, the BWO at some level, right, taking on this repression, and at the same time bringing with it the kind of problem of producing people in terms of this repression, right? The role debt plays is effectively facilitating that production so that the germinal influx can not only be repressed, but also you kind of have this open way of producing people um, in kind of tandem with that, right? So this is kind of what the theater of cruelty is giving us there, is it's a kind of medium for that production.
Yes. And we'll get more specifically into that because that's coming up, I think, in the rest of this. So I'm going to continue in the next paragraph because I don't want to lose that, because what you're talking about, it literally carries in. So we're just going to start the next paragraph. Far from being an appearance assumed by exchange, debt is the immediate effect or the direct means of the territorial and corporeal inscription process. Debt is the direct result of inscription. Once again, no revenge, no ressentiment will be invoked here. That is not the ground they grow on any more than does Oedipus. The fact that innocent men suffer all the marks on their bodies derives from a respective autonomy of their voice and the graphic action, and also from the autonomous eye that extracts pleasure from the event. It is not because everyone is suspected in advance of being a future bad debtor. The contrary would be closer to the truth. It is the bad debtor who must be understood as if the marks had not sufficiently taken on him, as if he were or had been unmarked. He has merely widened beyond the limits allowed the gap that separated the voice of alliance and the body of filiation to such a degree that it is necessary to reestablish the equilibrium through an increase in pain. Nietzsche doesn't say this, but what does it matter? For it is indeed here that he encounters the terrible equation of debt. Injury done equals pain to be suffered. How does one explain, he asks, that the criminal's pain can serve as an equivalent of the harm he has done? How can one pay back with suffering? An I must be invoked that extracts pleasure from the event. This has nothing to do with vengeance. Something that Nietzsche himself calls the evaluating eye, or the eye of the gods who enjoy cruel spectacles. And in punishment, there is so much that is festive. So much is pain part of an active life and an obliging gaze. The equation injury equals pain has nothing exchangist about it. And it shows in this extreme case that the debt itself had nothing to do with exchange. Simply stated, the eye extracts from the pain it is contemplating a surplus value of code that compensates the broken relationship between the voice of alliance that the criminal has wronged and the mark that had not sufficiently penetrated his body. The crime, a rupture of the phonographic connection, reestablished by the spectacle of the punishment as primitive justice, territorial representation has foreseen everything. Love it. Love this paragraph. Where do we start? Let's start from the beginning, I think. I'll do the same thing again. What questions do you got to start with? What part does our eye play in debt? Our eye is not, it's not so much that you're thinking about that our eye or our, like our pain or this. It's thinking instead about how people are placed within these social structures and how they come to sort of value them and see them as the structure. The example they gave of this sort of odd take on structuralism, which is like a constructivism of sorts, is that with debt being the result of this inscription, again, this is not an exchange. You don't exchange one person's pain for another. You could even take this today and watch sort of how anyone thinks in general, how an eye for an eye works. You can see it very often. Tune into some right-wing channels. It's really, really prevalent. But I would say even pseudo left-wing channels where you start talking about how someone can be paid for something, how someone can pay back their debt. They've done wrong. They have broken effectively this social contract. Now, is it because, again, we're talking about not capital here, we're talking about the earth. Is it because the earth didn't foresee this? No. Is it because the scarification or the recording in them didn't take? Yes. Is it because the scar failed? No. Just wasn't deep enough. It wasn't strong enough. They weren't made right. They weren't made correctly. They weren't recorded on properly. It's because of this that we don't really exchange pain for pain. It's not that a person can give their life in a death penalty case for the life that they took. That's not the exchange. What's produced of this debt sort of setup is excess code through those watching, the extra meaning that is sort of made through this. This setup doesn't pay back the suffering. It's not really the setup there, but it's this evaluating eye, as Nietzsche says, the eye of the gods who enjoy cruel spectacles. Pain as a part of this equation, injury equals pain, just to read it again, has nothing exchangist about it. It isn't that injury equals pain. It shows in this extreme case the debt itself has nothing to do with exchange. Simply stated, the eye extracts from the pain it is contemplating a surplus value of code that compensates the broken relationship between the voice of alliance, the criminal wronged, and the mark that didn't sufficiently penetrate his body. So when a criminal is punished and everyone's watching and taking it in, the meaning that is taken in, the surplus code that is generated by the eye being part of that, is the sort of payment effectively for this. This is the thing that sort of seals this and also continues and reinforces this. It is the entirety of the transaction. If it was just exchanges, then we could go, okay, cool. Yeah, you stole, so we're taking your hand. Now we're even. But it's not just that. It's the watching. It's the secondary production that is happening of excess code, of meaning, excess meaning that is coming about from this. This is the stuff that matters. I don't know if contempt for the concept of contemplation. You might have to explain that one to me.
Let's not save that for
Yeah, save it for later. I'm curious.
the archives and all the
Fair enough.
catacombs and that.
Go ahead, Jack.
I've inadvertently. Okay. So I mean, debt is the direct result of inscription, right? So the thing that's coming out in this paragraph, as I read it, is like it. So I mean, on one hand, you've got the territorialization of the socius in general, right? And then you've got the way the socius falls back on production, which is huge for when we're dealing with extension, right? Because this is where we have the the limit and that kind of it's like crossing the chasm, so to speak, but without violating the chasm, right? Because you can't violate the limit of incest because it's impossible, right? That's not the purpose it serves. Not to make it too illogical, but you get what I mean. It's not its function. Um, so that being said, right, the and this is nice because it's bringing forward the title of this section, right? The kind of subject they're closing on here is basically the territorial representation, right? So like as I was just describing, right, the theater of cruelty and its kind of role as a medium for the repression of the germinal influx and the use of the alliant to do the repressing, right? And we can walk in that disfigured image of Oedipus, right? One of the things they're now adding to that is the way that that's territorial and representative, right? So notice we've talked about repression and they're bringing in the other part of that term, which is representation. And as we keep wondering, right, it kind of, I think it is at least worth still exploring that the eye may function as a celibate machine here, because as we're dealing with that territorialization, right, what's kind of interesting about this is the more they lean on, territorial representation as foreseen, right, there seems to dovetailing the previous transition sentence too, right, a memory straining toward the future, creating memory toward the future, foreseeing, right? Taking the future in terms of the present, as opposed to, I think what Nietzsche does is try to look at how the future changes the present, um, at least so we can wonder. So, I mean, to kind of bring this into the paragraph and then hand it off to someone else, um, simply stated the eye extracts from the pain and is contemplating a surplus value of code that compensates the broken relationship between the voice of alliance and the criminal, I'm sorry, between the voice of alliance that the criminal has wronged and the mark that had not sufficiently penetrated the body. So notice, like, it's again that language of like you have a sign in relation to a body, right? And this connective synthesis language whereby the movement is facilitated through the disjunction. And in this sense, what the eye is giving us, right, is that with the repression, there's a kind of effect on the disjunction and by extension, the connection, right? And what the eye is doing is compensating for that, which has an economic and a psychoanalytic connotation, right? It's making up for something, right? Not changing that that's what's happening, but kind of making up for it, right? Compensating for it. In that sense, part of what we're getting here is that surplus value of code, right? This which plays into the territorialization itself. So we're starting to get into like voluptus, I think. Broken relationship between the voice of alliance, right? And alliance does the repressing that the criminal has wronged. So the body, so to speak, has wronged the alliant, has wronged the repressive, and the mark that had not sufficiently penetrated his body. So notice that like one of the codes here needs to penetrate the body more, right? It's taking on some additional functionality, maybe some additional intensivity, given that it's penetrating the body, right? That's kind of the interesting thing about this language, because to that level, the representation here, one of the ways they kind of offer it is, in a sense, as a spectacle of punishment, right? Reestablished by the spectacle of the punishment, not because they're interested in the spectacle for its own sake, but because of how the spectacle plays into production here. Because notice the repression and the repression, the repression and the representation are still productive here.
Absolutely. I like that a lot. Yeah, it's the excess of, it's not, again, the exchangist versus the debt. The exchangist view would be that two people, like the thing he's paying back his debt to society by serving the time, or getting the punishment or whatever it may be. And it's not so much that as it is the eye, the eye of the observer, whoever it may be, that is having that sort of secondary code generated that's making that excess. Again, remembering that there is no closed system, that there's this excess that's built between anything. It can't simply be exchangist. It has to be that debt. At least that'd be how I phrase it.
Are you saying that there's always guilt associated with debt?
Yes. I'm not even, yeah. I think so. I think that's
Okay.
fair. Jack? You were going to say something. I know you. I saw you.
I think that's coming up in the next paragraph.
It
They haven't
is.
really
It
gone
is.
into guilt here,
It is.
but it's going to be discussed. I just can't remember how they go about it at this point.
I think saying
I'm
yes
not
is
gonna be
okay for now.
helpful.
Yes is okay for now. There's nuances to it, but I think it's fair. Nietzsche does for sure, Bataille does as well, and they want to break that. But I think there's more things happening with it. Again, as you can see already, they're really going beyond and talking through sort of the machinery of this constructivist view of how the social is built. The way debt working is not simply one person paying off a debt, but it's the sort of the punishment, the pain, and then the pain being experienced by someone, and that secondary meaning that can come with it, that sort of produces that excess of code that's able to come with. And we'll get to that because guilt is coming up really fast here. And I want to sort of talk through, because again, we're coming up, this is a new paragraph in the original French, which is always makes me happy. But again, they break it up a little bit, so it's a long one. So bear with me, and we will take our time through it. Don't worry. Any last notes before I dive forward?
I've got one, but I'll give someone else a chance before I go.
Yeah, because this is going to end this section. And then I think we probably will move on and begin the next, because it dives right fucking in. It dives right in.
Oh, wow. New socius today.
Yeah, we get to go right into the new socius, because we've spent a lot of time on the territorial machine, and we've kind of covered it. It's the material conditions of the earth, meeting desire directly, the carving of the earth, the carving of the skin, the non-exchange of society, instead mobile blocks of debt, and the excess of pain, or the excess of code that is generated from interactions of debt, that is sort of the bigger deal, the theater of cruelty. What?
We're all good Artovians here.
It's a great phrase. It's a fucking really good phrase.
He was ahead of his time.
So just ask, maybe, I'm not sure if this is relevant. How many kinds of socius are there?
There are the three, and then in theory, they refer to like the fourth.
Okay, all right. There's 3 kinds.
So we got 3. We got the earth, the despot, and capital.
And then the 4th one is what?
Whatever the fuck's next.
Okay, thanks.
They call it the new earth, but yeah, they don't really, like Brooks was saying, it's not like they elaborate beyond, even that's kind of not saying a lot, right? But just to keep us moving, then the last thing I want to focus on was the the equation of debt. It's always nice when we get some mathematics for debt. The injury done is equal to the pain to be suffered. So I mean, notice what's being said there, right? Like this injury done, there's a point being made about the alliant, right? Which is on one hand part of the disjunction, as we've seen in both, you know, uh, in a kind of inclusive way in terms of like the ambiguous, and in a kind of exclusive way in terms of the extension, which is largely what they've been focusing on here. And it's also going to play a role in doing the repressing, right? So there's an injury done in a political and economical sense that is equal to the pain to be suffered, right? So I think that the kind of thing they're getting at here is it's not so much about, like a one-to-one, well, it is kind of about an equatability here. But at the same time, if you notice, it's also about producing a surplus, right? So the equatability is more in a sense about creating an extra, right? And that's that surplus value of code, because that's what the I is going to extract, right? How can one pay back with suffering? And I must be invoked, that it extracts pleasure from the event. It has nothing to do with vengeance, right? Notice they're also saying like it's not about revenge, it's not about resentment, right? It's not about those things as the basis, right? Those kind of affects, we might say. It's about that simple equation so that the I can produce, well, the I can extract the surplus value of code. So as we're thinking about how the repression, the representation are functional for production, right? Even though they repress it, they also work with it productively. One of the ways it is going to be productive, right, is in using that surplus value of code as part of how they say, right, creating the primitive justice, the territorial representation, right? Arguably, I would say it's going to be important here for understanding the primitive, and this concept will get developed in each of the two coming socii.
Brilliant. Handful of notes, reasons I hate this translation. You'll hear me change out a handful of words. They translate destiny as fate, and I have no idea why the fuck they do that. It's little things like that throughout this book that make me kind of nuts. They're not the same word at all. It's whatever. Deleuze has a very specific line with destiny he's used throughout his stuff, especially recently in Logic of Sense. Well, he was writing this, whatever. I just need to get over that shit. Stupid fucking thing. Coding pain and death. It has foreseen everything. And again, remember here, we're talking of the territorial representation. We're talking about the socius. It has foreseen everything, except for the way its own death would come to it from without. They come like destiny, without reason, consideration, or pretext. They appear as lightning appears, too terrible, too convincing, too sudden, too different even to be hated. Their work is an instinctive creation, an imposition of forms. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists there are. Wherever they appear, something new arises, a ruling structure that lives, in which parts and functions are delimited and coordinated, in which nothing whatever finds a place that has not first been assigned a meaning in relation to the whole. They do not know what guilt, responsibility, or consideration are. These born organizers, they exemplify that terrible artist's egoism that has the look of bronze and knows itself justified to all eternity in the work, like a mother in her child. It is not in them that the bad consciousness developed, that goes without saying, but it would not have developed if a tremendous quantity of freedom had not been expelled from the world, or at least from the visible world, and made, as it were, latent under their hammer blows and artists' violence. Pardon me. End quote. It is here that Nietzsche speaks of a break, a rupture, a leap. Who are these beings, they who come like destiny? Quote, some pack of blonde beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race which organized for war and with the ability to organize, unhesitatingly lays its terrible claws upon a populace, perhaps tremendously superior in numbers, but still formless. Even the most ancient African myths speak to us of these blonde men. They are the founders of the state. Nietzsche will come to establish the existence of other breaks, those of the Greek city-states, Christianity, democratic and bourgeois humanism, industrial society, capitalism, and socialism. But it could be that all these, in various ways, presuppose this first great hiatus, although they all claim to repel and to fill it. It could be that, spiritual or temporal, tyrannical or democratic, capitalist or socialist, there has never been but a single state, the state as dog that speaks with flaming roars. And Nietzsche suggests how this new socius proceeds, a terror without precedent, in comparison with which the ancient system of cruelty, the forms of primitive regimentation and punishment, are nothing. A concerted destruction of all the primitive coatings, or worse yet, their derisory preservation, their reduction to the condition of secondary parts in a new machine, and the new apparatus of repression. All that constituted the essential element of the primitive inscription machine, the blocks of mobile, open, finite debts, the parcels of destiny, finally translated right, finds itself taken into an immense machinery that renders the debt infinite and no longer forms anything but one and the same crushing fate. The aim now is to preclude, pessimistically once and for all, the prospect of a final discharge. The aim now is to make the glance recoil disconsolately from an iron impossibility. The earth becomes a madhouse. Arachne asks, do the translators translate sense of fate, destiny as destiny, or as fate uniformly? No, they change it, and it's generally nonsensical, to be perfectly frank. They're even quoting like Nietzsche here, and the other translations, he's very particular about how he speaks of fate and destiny, very, very specifically. Like it's if they didn't specifically have writings where they're like fate and destiny aren't the same thing, and they shit on fate, well, they kind of shit on both, but they've decided they're different. Like, it's not like they don't use, it's in French, the word is destiné. Like, it's not a different word. It's destiné, just with two E's, but they change it to fate. It's like, come on, guys. But then later they don't. They do this over and over. It's like flux and flow. They don't translate that correctly, but it's also inconsistent. So it's very frustrating. But anyway, we end the territorial machine. and the discussion of it and its socius with how it ends, how it comes to end, its own death, the nature of these mobile blocks of fate. What are they waiting for? What is it not able to withstand? How is it not able to sort of work? What isn't it ready for? And this is, they use some great pieces from Nietzsche here. Really love this passage where he's talking very cleanly about the sort of imperial class, how they appear, how they come to these groups, how their ability to organize the efficiencies of life, you could say. And they may come, a small number of them, on a much larger group, but that much larger group doesn't have a form. It's a really amazing thing. If you go back through and you read a lot of sort of first contact stories or tales of general imperialist sort of ways we talk about things. For example, I'm American, so the Native Americans as a thing, when they were first confronted, there's a lot of people who really talk about it like they didn't have a society. Like, come on, they just like went around places. They didn't have a society. The people in Mayflower, they had a society. They understood family. They understood hierarchy. They had a king. They were nomads. They didn't really do very much. They were formless. There's some truth in that, in the sense of they didn't have a social order as we understand it or as a state imposes it. They had no form. There could be multitudes of them, but against a form, that's the challenge. And it's this state as it comes, and they will come to call it the Urstadt, the Ubers, the state that has started and only has ever been. The way that this has gone sort of through time, the state as dog, they really have opinions here, but they'll be getting to that into its own section. But this new socius that is and we'll be talking about it just in a moment, it's despotic. This move, we have this ancient systems of cruelty, and it seems, my God, how barbaric that they do this to each other. This theater of cruelty. And it's like, yeah, but you haven't seen shit yet. It's going to be so much worse. And they do this awful thing where they either get rid of wholesale, they just obliterate the culture that they're taking over, or they allow it to sort of come in and sort of be taken in general. It's really an extraordinary sort of bifurcation, gone completely, or accoutrements that are sort of attached to the edge of the thing. I think of, as I walk around, I'm in Washington State, which has a long history of issues with indigenous people, we'll say, but there's a lot of totem poles in businesses here that make you think for a second, like that kind of shit. Much more outwardly would be the usage of a lot of the symbology of Alexander the Great, for example, or conquerors in the East, whatever it may be, took on accoutrements of tribes they'd conquer and would use them sort of as dressage. And Nietzsche talks about this again, this thing that they do as they sort of make their way through, and ultimately the aim changes. Now it is to preclude pessimistically, one for all, this prospect of a final discharge. The aim now is to make the glance recoil disconsolately. Fucking, why do they use complicated words? Because it's a really interesting way that they've sort of changed the meaning of that. Sorry, if someone wants to talk, it's going to take me a second as I read. Because it's quoting Nietzsche again. It will therefore be necessary that the prospect of a rational liberation disappears once and for all in the pessimistic mist. The desperate look, the look he had discussed, will then have to be discouraged and faced with this iron impossibility. The earth becomes an asylum of insane people. The earth becomes a madhouse, is the final sort of note. The shift of what the look means and what it's looking at, it must now avert its eyes. It must change how its debt works. It must change how it operates. And we'll be understanding how that's used and how these things are carried through in the next section as we go through. But this is them talking about the end of one and the beginning of another when it comes to the socii. I hope that makes sense. It's a really, there's a lot said here that it's kind of like I could go into, but it's literally leading into the barbarian despotic machine for a reason. And so it's kind of like, I want to just say it's coming. So we're almost there. Right? It's like 4 minutes and we'll read it, kind of thing. But it's tough. So if anyone has a thought, or Jack, if you want to add to that, because there's a lot that could be said here. I'm sure I'm leaving out stuff that's really important.
Sure. Okay, so I've been focusing on like that mechanism between like the object and the chain, right? The way those two interact. So as you can see, this last paragraph, right? It opens up focusing on codification. Now, that's kind of that's a thing they return to throughout this paragraph, right? So for basic sense, right? Like the Microsoft Defender is working. That kind of general theme we've been talking about the role of the aligned affiliative for the ambiguous sign and for the extensive sign, where it's more of a hard plus or minus as opposed to a somewhat plus, somewhat minus situation, right? That part of the codification is in a way what's at stake here, right? And by extension, what's going on for the syntheses as it pertains kind of to producing that code, right? Because as we know, the surplus value of code is where they just ended their discussion on territorial representation, right? And so see, it all comes together in its own kind of gumbo. So following that, right, in that sense, the socius has foreseen everything by codification, right? And yet it hasn't seen that something coming, right, something without, something kind of external, is going to be what ends the primitive socius, right? And again, with that theme of something coming, right, very Nietzschean in that respect. Um, so I'm not too interested in the fate language because I think what they're kind of getting at here is a little bit more about the change. It is here that Nietzsche speaks of a break, a rupture, a leap. So, right, this is quite literally a break in social production with itself in terms of socii, right? That's what they're really setting up here. Who are these people? I'm sorry. This is what happens when you read on angle. Who are those beings? They who come like fate. Uh, they are the founders of the state, right? So notice the emphasis going forward. That's going to become important, and it's a little tricky. But if you notice, the point they make is the Greek polis, Christianity, democracy, bourgeois humanism, industrial society, capitalism, and socialism. Although this list may have some redundancies, right? The point they're making is that in each case, the kind of thing they rely on, right, or we might say the social body following the language of AO, is going to be the state in a manner of speaking. They'll explain it more later, but they're just setting up the point now. And Nietzsche suggests how this new socius proceeds, a terror without precedent in comparison with the ancient system of cruelty. So notice everything we just discussed in terms of cruelty as this kind of medium of representation, repression, and the way that that affects production, right? That use of cruelty, one of the things that's going to change is it's going to become the use of terror, right? Notice the stark change in that language, which they suggest is actually worse than cruelty, right? Finally, and I think this dovetails where I began, and I think this is really critical. A concerted, it's always destruction, a concerted destruction of all the primitive codings or worse yet, their derisory preservation, their reduction to the condition of secondary parts in the new machine, and the new apparatus of repression, all that constituted the essential element of the primitive machines, the blots of mobile, open finite debts, the so-called parts of destiny, parcels of destiny. So stopping there, right? Remember everything I was saying about code in terms of the alliant and the filiative, this production of debt, right? And the way that it's finite and yet open. So one of the reasons they've harped on this not being exchanges is to maintain open and expansive libidinal economy, right? And even though it's open and expansive, they haven't harped on the infinite here, because in this sense, the debt is finite. So the codifications I was talking about, right, part of their function is finitely rather than infinitely, meaning they kind of parcel out, right? They are kind of self-contained, so to speak. What's going to change is they're now going to become, right, infinite debt and no longer forms anything but same crushing fate. And I'm not so interested in the fate here because the other point that I want to focus on is this point about like a kind of integration, right? So notice the reduction to the condition of secondary parts in the new machine, the new apparatus of repression. So notice that here codification is either destroyed or it's incorporated in a secondary way for inscription. So inscription itself is going to change so that the use of signifiers and everything we've been discussing, this form of debt, is going to become secondary, right? So it's still at play, but it's secondary to something more primary, which we'll later learn is like the signifieds, right? So they're kind of continuing with the semiotics, but we'll dive into that more when we get there. But just to tee that up, so you've got some kind of mnemonic for it.
There's two things. First off, the reason it destiny matters is because it's the original word in Nietzsche, and it drives me nuts. But it's things like, for example, going back and rereading, I realized I sort of missed a big shift. They use the phrase, the new translation in English, ends the previous and then starts this with the idea of territorial representation has foreseen everything. Coding pain and death, it has foreseen everything. They don't use, this is not at all what is said. Proper translation would be territorial representation has planned for everything. It's not the same thing at all. It's not in the same fucking word. It's fucking crazily different. Coding pain and death, it has, the phrasing is very particular how they're using it. The French would say instead, she has it all planned out, coding pain and death. Except in the way which their own death was going to come to them from the outside. This setup here, as they're talking about it, and the move that they're making again, the sort of structure, the constructivist version of how this mobile debt operates and how it's written and how these things sort of interact. It is planned for and is able to take on everything except. It's able to take on someone breaking the rules, because if someone breaks the rules, I think you could very easily say, well, then the rules don't fucking work. But no, the way that the debt operates and that secondary bit of the theater of cruelty and the way that these things are laid out, it's planned for, because then you just have to extract enough pain from the person to have them pay their debt to society. This thing seen, this excess is created. So actually, it's not even that they broke the rules. The rules aren't broken at all. They failed the rules. It's a difference. And this difference places the sort of presumption around that sort of, again, desire being directly matched with the sort of material conditions and being immediately sort of taken and invested socially. When someone has broken the rules, we just get to go, oh, cool, it's fine. The rules are fine. They failed. Not that the rules failed or fucked up. It's an important distinction because I think it has through lines through all of this. As we talk about coding pain and death, the earth socius has planned for everything except for its own death. It's not able to sort of play that sort of game of what can be outside of our system. And the part from Genealogy of Morals, I feel like I want to read a little bit, because it really, they use very particular sections of this. They come like fate without reason, without pretext. There's some amazing bits, but I want to read just the paragraph it's in. It's a Genealogy Morality, Part 2, Section 17. The first assumption, this is Nietzsche, the first assumption in my theory on the origin of bad conscience is that the alteration was not gradual and voluntary, and did not represent an organic assimilation into new circumstances, but was a breach, a leap, a compulsion, an inescapable destiny that nothing could ward off, which occasioned no struggle, not even any resentment. A second assumption, however, is that the shaping of a population, which had, up till now, been unrestrained and shapeless, into a fixed form, as happened at the beginning with an act of violence, could only be concluded with acts of violence. Consequently, the oldest state emerged as a terrible tyranny, as a repressive and ruthless machinery, and continued working until the raw material of people and semi-animals had been finally not just needed and made compliant, but shaped. I use the word state, but it is obvious who I mean. Some pack of blond beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race, which, organized on a war footing and with the power to organize, unscrupulously lays its dreadful paws on a populace which, though it might be vastly greater in number, is still shapeless and shifting. In this way, the state began on earth. I think I've dispensed with the fantasy, which has it begin with a contract. Whoever can command, whoever is a master by nature, whoever appears violent in deed and gesture, what is he going to care about contracts? Such beings cannot be reckoned with. They come like fate. Yes, the actual use of it. Without cause, reason, consideration, or pretext. They appear just like lightning appears, too terrible, sudden, convincing, and other even to be hated. What they do is to create and imprint forms instinctively. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists there are. Where they appear, soon something new arises, a structure of domination that lives, in which parts and functions are differentiated and related to one another, in which there is no room for anything that does not first acquire meaning with regard to the whole. They do not know what guilt, responsibility, consideration are, these born organizers. They're ruled by that terrible inner artist's egoism, which has a brazen countenance and sees itself justified to all eternity by the work, like a mother and her child. They are not the ones in whom this bad conscience grew, that is obvious, but it would not have grown without them. This ugly growth would not be there if a huge amount of freedom had not been driven from the world, or at least driven from sight, and at the same time made latent by the pressure of their hammer blows and artist's violence. This instinct of freedom forcibly made latent. We've already seen how this instinct of freedom forced back, repressed, incarcerated within itself, and finally able to discharge and unleash itself only against itself. That, and that alone, is bad conscience and its beginnings. That's fascinating, Arachne. I want to understand fate, because it's we'll get into that another time. But I wanted to talk about this because the big shift that they're talking about here is not a sort of minor change from the previous thing, I think would be the way to put it. It isn't saying that this happened in a day. It didn't happen. It happened suddenly, maybe on geological terms, but it is not a thing that happened in like a few moments and then, hey, there's a new thing. It also isn't something that's sort of only a minor shift. We're talking about a major change in how not only meaning, but social structures exist as a whole and as they operate sort of around all of this. That shift, we have the coding of pain and death that is seen. We have this setup being taken away and having it shifted to a very different type of structure, one that utilizes sort of power, top-down forms and controls in this way, it's not even possible for them to sort of deal with each other without one completely consuming the other. It's really a kind of a beautiful piece from Nietzsche that I think has been borne out recent ethnological studies, and people who study sort of uncontacted tribes are really only one tribe that's semi-uncontacted. There's only a couple. And how just the way our languages begin to interact affects and changes and breaks them down and changes how they operate in general. It's kind of an extraordinary setup. It's a great piece to end. And here's how we switch from one socius to the next. So there you go. Really good stuff. What questions do you have about this section? We can probably start the barbarian despotic today, because I think it will help a little bit to sort of dovetail right in. But before I go on, what questions do you have? Where do you want to talk about so far? The Earth Socius, because we aren't talking about the Earth Socius. If there's stuff about the Earth Socius, don't ask about where it's going, but like it itself. What questions do you have? How would you want to know more? What can we discuss more? Things like that. I'll leave it open for a moment. I'm happy to. You guys know me. I'm happy to be awkward as hell for a few moments and have this very frustrating me rambling, almost forcing you to have to talk for a second and make it, oh God, what's he doing? I better talk. I better ask a question. That'd be nice. Or not. Maybe you guys are great. That works for me too. Jack, any last notes before I move on to the despotic machine?
A question was raised about debt. So I asked for clarification, just because if the question is how does debt differ between the two socii, like I would just say, going off the paragraph we read, right, it's that codification is going, so it's the onus they're putting on is codification, right? In the primitive, codification is it's debt itself, in a manner of speaking, right? In that sense, what's going to change is that we're going to move from finite blots of debt, right, to infinite debt. And by extension, insofar as we would be dealing with codes through like signifiers, in the despotic, we're going to be dealing with, so it's going to become credit through the signified. But for our purposes here, right, it's that kind of sense of where the signifier becomes secondary. Where does debt end? For the primitive, the debt ends, I think it's basically in that equation for the so that the surplus can be extracted. It's like basically like when those lines are drawn and everything, and things move through the lines laterally between the align and the affiliative. In a manner of speaking, the debt itself is kind of closed so that the system is open. Closed in the sense that it's not about taking one debt and perpetuating it endlessly. It's about how different debts create different debts, so that the actual process doesn't have to take one debt and blow it up so that that's the debt that counts.
Yeah, inside of that setup, you might think of like a large scale tribal system. It's the debt is by being finite, and literally think of it as mobile blocks of debt, like Tetris pieces of debt that sort of move between families or groups or areas of the tribe. Like just like they're being very literal. This is not an allegory. They're not metamorphizing. This is just this. The blocks of debt move from one place to another as various things happen. It doesn't allow debt to sort of concentrate in one place, because it wouldn't work if this guy owes everyone everything. It doesn't work the same way as, everyone's exchanged and just this guy's happened to have gotten everything, which is kind of the exchanges view. Stupid. No, debt doesn't allow that. This mobile reciprocal setup ensures, first off, as Jack said, there's no closed system of exchange here. There's kind of this constant open-ended, everything sort of coming in. And the differences, to quote Holland, different determinate patterns of circulation of debt produce only differences in rank, which arise from the ebb and flow of debt obligations and are hence always subject to change. There is not a sort of way to quantify debt exactly. Like, you never sit here and go, oh yeah, no, Steve owes me 3 hands or 4 eyes of cruelty. It's not really set up that way. The ways they work is it's far more qualitative. It's far more contextualized and contingent and determinate socially. And so this savage social organization shifts things around in this way. When we move to the despotic, that debt, well, mobile blocks of finite debt can't really ever sit in one place because of how they sort of work. An infinite debt owed towards a conqueror or, naked political power, effectively, very different. And this is how we're going to get into sort of how this operates. And that's what this next session really dives into. How is it infinite? How is it finite? It's again, if you think about it as, I'm a little confused. We'll go back. Want to initiate some kind of anti-world pro-Earth project? They oppose. Oh no, they're not like pro-Earth. Like, they're pro-New Earth, and that's the phrase they use for the upcoming whatever socius. But they do not valorize kind of the savage territorial at all. It's a place of naked cruelty, like brutality and cruelty in extraordinary ways. It's not as bad as under despotic cruelty, but that's more a sense of scale and brutality than it is like the life anyone gets to live. There's no freedom in this sort of prehistoric tribe like thing. That's not how it's set up. There's no freedom. There's carved into you what you owe and where you're at, and you're kind of done, and you're kind of just part of the social order. There's no meaning and subjectivity operate drastically differently there. Are they anti-world? I don't know what you mean by anti-world. They're not anti-social. All these things are necessary. I don't even think they're anti-repression. Honestly, it's a matter of how it comes about and what it reinforces. And they spent a lot of time, especially Guattari, after this, talking through that, because they don't valorize the schizo, even though a lot of people fuck that up and think they're like, oh, go be schizo. They're not at all, at all, because the schizo is disconnected from the social. They don't bounce off the limit. They penetrate through it, and they can't return. They become completely disconnected. That's not good. They don't at any point cheer this on. They cheer the process on, because the process of that can obliterate fascising and micro-fascising tendencies. That setup that they're talking about there is the thing. The regimes of world and earth obviously often form semiotic intersection in the sense of how apocalyptic religions reject the world, but instead of heaven, they emphasize the earth. I would have to spend a little bit of time and think about how to best phrase a response. These questions are not stupid. They're interesting. It's just not really where the reading's at. So it's a kind of a larger thing. My version, just because I'll end up just repeating it. If you pick up Holland's guide on Anti-Oedipus, which is his introduction to schizoanalysis, he goes through what he sees as the fourth socius. He also wrote another book called Nomad Capitalism, which is fantastic. Market Communism. I think it's called both of those. Great title, and his belief in what the fourth socius is matches mine, how he reads this. So it's worth reading through that. It's a little different, I think, than what we're talking about, though. So I'm not going to get too deep into it. But yeah, read Holland. Holland's great every time. I always recommend read Holland. All right. How is everyone good for starting Barbarian Despotic Machine? Or do I have another question that I need to get into? Rimka, do you want us to go through finite and debt? Because it's a doable thing and it's worthwhile. Sweet. Oh, Lily demands it too. So the answer is yes, Rimka. Sorry. You don't get to say no. I'm fine. See, there we go. I told you. I knew what you were going to say. When their critique, and I'm going to go through their critique again because I think it's worthwhile. When you go back and you look at the social structure of any indigenous tribe, it is very easy for you to go, oh, look, here's the family trees. Here's how these people were connected. And here's the structure of that society. And you can go, look, see, this family and this family, they exchanged, I don't know, fucking 4 goats and a bunch of corn for the daughter on this side. They exchanged. This was their trade. See, it's an exchange society. This is how they were built. See, look, there's records of it. You're like, yeah, see, this is how it worked. My name is Strauss. This was his setup. And they had a bunch of his students, some very, very, very bright ones, specifically, I would say Godelier, Maurice Godelier, if you can go read it, went, well, wait, we're kind of doing this in this retroactive looking back reality of what their society was, because we have all these recordings. We have this quantified thing. But is that really how it worked at the time? Because it isn't so much that this family was trading this daughter for the goats and some grain. There was a lot more going on. This family, see, had issues with this other family because of work that had been done or a badly made chair. I don't fucking know. Godelier goes in length. I'm not going to be able to bring it back up. But it's like, so this was going on, but also their social position, they had gathered a lot of other debts from general families because of how they'd interacted with them. So they actually owed a lot of people these things. This other family was one of, lesser social ranking, but the debt of them, they could put and move all these debts they collected, these mobile blocks of debts, to that other family by doing this thing that was sort of this gifty type thing of like, oh no, you're below us, but we really think it would be lovely if our daughter married into your family. Because there's a lot of social weird shit that happens inside of these tribes of how someone marries someone else. And even far more than what I'm saying, you're talking about like near infinite numbers of little tiny interactions and things that are sort of informing why a thing happened. This contingent creation, this intensive version of it is wholly lost when you just go plus minus done, happy day, this is it, if you go Strauss's way. So instead of this exchangist mathematical quantitative looking back, it's instead realizing that the actual lived realities of these people is blocks of debt. And don't think of, I said Tetris pieces. Maybe I should have been more specific, not big giant ones. Like this isn't a city made out of big giant Tetris blocks, but instead think about all of your interactions that you have literally all day, including right here, as you're listening, as you're reading, you feel obligated to people. Everyone kind of goes through this. You feel obligated to people based on sort of a lot of things. Dude, can I talk to this person? Can I say hi? This person said hi. I feel obligated to say hi back, whatever it is. That this pushed out and done at sort of a larger scale across society. Think about that and all of these little tiny mobile blocks of finite debt, moving and zipping around constantly through all these interactions. This is how society operated. This is where we started. We didn't start from an exchange's position of this plus minus married gun exchange, but instead through this really strange moving set of blocks. And the blocks, because of how they're set up, you can't really collect them. I mean, you don't really want to, I think would be a better way to put it. You don't want, like, it's not so much you want everyone to owe you. You don't want to owe everyone, because it's, again, mobile blocks of debt. If it's an exchangeist, you do want everyone to owe you. That's great. That's Mr. Monopoly. That's bankers. That's capitalism. We want that, but that's an exchangeist view. You don't want to owe everyone. So you're constantly sort of moving things up. They go through gifting. Again, the Enigma of the Gift by Godelier, Metamorphosis of Kinship by Godelier, 2 books that will absolutely blow apart how you understand this if you're having issues. Really, really great, very concretizing, but it's really getting into the real complexities of how people sort of deal with each other in these tribes, and how this setup doesn't really allow what we would call wealth, because we think of it as exchange, but think of that as instead like lack of debt, because people who owe and constantly owe, they've got to pay for it, and they will pay for it. And how they pay for it, how they set it up, keeps these blocks moving. This setup basically ensures that you never have really one consolidated set of power. And we didn't, in most of these tribes, the chiefs don't operate like a despot. It's instead just another family, and sort of doesn't really do much. Like, they don't have choice or power, as instead they've got to do what the tribe needs. And it's a lot more complex than that. Again, Godelier goes really well into this. So have a lot of more recent ethnologists. So the setup is different. So when we talk about debt, it is very much thinking the opposite of an exchangeist view. It's instead thinking about blocks of debt in terms of what people owe each other, and then how you will pay. Not how you'll pay for it. Oh, here's $10, but how you will pay. That's the difference. And this shift that happens as the blonde dogs that come chomping and attacking, they come into this formless, fairly non-set world. There's code, there's excess code, there's rules, but it's not formed. There's no hierarchy, there's no stability, there's no king. Not in the same way. A chief isn't really the same thing. The chief can't just order, all right, everyone now go make, I don't know, go fucking farm. What? No, that's not, the chief doesn't do that. Despots do. So how these things interact and how they play, suddenly you have this form coming to the formless. This formless, these mobile blocks of debt that are formless, take on a very different setup when we talk about how the graphism, the etching and the voice shift, and how the voice shifts. And this is what we're going to be getting into in the Barbarian Despotic Machine. Did that help Lily and Rimka?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
that really cleared it up. Like the gifting is almost, it's integral to life. If you're not gifting, you're not living. You're not, yeah.
Effectively, because it's one of those things that, again, you don't want to just accumulate debt. That's because you will pay. That's the thing to remember, is you will pay. Everyone always pays. That's the thing. So you don't want to pay. So there you go. All right. Any last questions? Jack, any notes on that? Was that a fairly decent rant? I left out a good amount around the syntheses, but hey, what can I say? It's more your jam anyway. All right. The Barbarian Despotic Machine. Oh shit, I'm not even sharing my screen. How awful am I for not doing that? God, this whole time. You should reread Geology Morals. You should reread everything Nietzsche, always. The Barbarian Despotic Machine. The founding of the despotic machine, or the barbarian socius, can be summarized in the following way: a new alliance and direct filiation. The despot challenges the lateral alliances and the extended filiations of the old community. He imposes a new alliance system and places himself in direct filiation with the deity. The people must follow. A leap into a new alliance, a break with the ancient filiation. This is expressed in a strange machine, or rather, a machine of the strange, whose locus is the desert, imposing the harshest and the most barren of ordeals, and attesting to the resistance of an order as well as to the validation of a new order. Sorry, 2 seconds.
Machine of the strange.
Yeah. No, I'm just sorry. I got a little note that popped up. Stupid fucking computer. The machine of the strange is both a great paranoiac machine, since it expresses the struggle with the old system, and already a glorious celibate machine, insofar as it exalts the triumph of a new alliance. The despot is the paranoiac. There's no longer any reason to forego such a statement, once one has freed oneself from the characteristic familialism of the concept of paranoia in psychoanalysis and psychiatry, and provided one sees in paranoia a type of investment of a social formation. And new perverse groups spread the despot's invention. Perhaps they even fabricated it for him. They broadcast his fame and impose his power in the towns they found or conquer. Wherever a despot and his army pass, doctors, priests, there you go, JK, scribes, and officials are part of the procession. It might be said that the ancient complementarity has shifted to form a new socius, no longer the bush paranoiac and the encampment, or village perverts, but the desert paranoiac and the town perverts. It's a nice, easy opening to a paragraph. The shift here is very simple, and it will continue to be if you keep remembering that everything is about the sort of XY graph almost, the alliant and the filiative. It's how these elements work together. It's about where you find yourself on them and how they happen. And for this, it's a movement away from the very simplified version of the alliant and filiative being my family, and the alliant being people my family marry, people I work with. This very simple XY graph to a new one, a new alliance, and now a direct filiation. This is both very fucked up versions of what came before, and really it's a big deal. Because the despot comes in. He imposes a new alliance system. This strange machine, or machine of the strange, imposing harshest of ordeals, attesting to the resistance of an old order as well as the validation of new. This setup, this new alliance, which we'll be getting into, breaks away from lateral alliances and also breaks away from the extended filiative. And now there is direct. The despot is basically everything's through them, generally him. This machine that is produced, the machine of the strange, is this great paranoiac machine. It expresses the struggle with the old system. This is why they call it paranoiac, but also a glorious celibate machine because it exalts this new alliance. The despot as the paranoiac, because the paranoia is directly invested in the social information. The perverts spread around him, maybe even fabricate this for him, broadcast fame and impose his power in towns they found or conquer. This procession they talk about, this new socius, it's no longer the bush paranoiac in the encampment, but the desert paranoiac and town perverts. I kind of just want to go right to the next paragraph because it does sort of expand on a few of these, but we can stop. Questions and thoughts, anyone? What do they mean by desert in this paragraph? See, asking the good questions that make me go, God damn it, I don't have an understanding of this text. It's a great question. Give me a 2 seconds. I want to reread the French. If anyone wants to dive in, feel free, because it's a particular usage, and they use desert so fucking much. Deleuze loves the fucking term. But yeah. Anyone? Come on, Jack. I know you're dying to jump in.
Not on desert?
Not on desert? I actually don't have a great answer for that. I'm trying to rack my brain a little bit, but I don't have one necessarily. Because again, he's speaking, it's a bit poetic. It's not directly like allegory, but it's definitely more on the poetic side as far as phrasing around that. How to put it? That's a great question. So the Bush paranoiac. If we go back, let's do that. Bush, because we're comparing. So it's the Bush paranoiac versus the desert. Bush paranoiac. Come on. I know the word is in this text. There it is. Oh, this is the Guattari. All right, this might help. In short, we shall see us elsewhere. There is always a pervert who succeeds the paranoiac or accompanies him, sometimes the same man in two situations, a bush paranoiac or a village pervert. This play that they're making here is talking about the way that people or subjects exist within the earth socius. A pure nomad does not exist. There is always already an encampment where it is a matter of stalking, however little, and where it is a matter of inscribing and allocating, of marrying and feeding oneself. So the bush paranoiac is someone who's able, as a hunter, they go out and they are thinking momentum, they're in line with the earth. They're not giving a fuck about anything else, but they are really, really, really focused on the earth, the signals and everything. They're tracking, they're hunting, they're killing. And then they return to the village where the social mores and rules are kind of being set up. So the bush paranoiac is one who is in the bush hunting and doing things. The shift here for them to be the paranoiac of the desert is interesting. God damn it. Oh no, they use desert all the time, and it's being touched into, and they are definitely referencing how they're going to talk about the BWO, how they're going to talk about the smooth surfaces of things, and how they have in the past. But this specific usage, if I had to guess, and it's an educated guess, is we're now talking about the formation of the state, and the first Urstadt was in Iraq, was in the desert. The desert paranoiac being the town pervert being the one who really single focusedly, but has nothing else to do except to head straight between cities. There's no hunting. It is going from place to place. You are now a vassal of the state effectively. So the desert being sort of nothing out there. There's no structures. There's no setup. The movement between them changes how the paranoiac deals with that, and also then gives the town pervert, who is there to extol the virtues of the state, to impart the will of the despot. I would think that would probably be close to where they're phrasing it. Desert paranoiac and town perverts being that. It's just the ancient complementarity has shifted to form a new socius, same as the old sort of, the more things change, the more they stay the same kind of thing. Yeah, I think that would be my guess, but
well, he's associating the machine of the strange with this idea of the desert, isn't it? So that might be, like what you're saying. It's between the states.
I think it is a reference to what is between the states, or the parts of all of this, because I do think there is a beginning of work being done here where the desert and how the not nomads, but the desert paranoiac, who's directly socially invested. That's what the paranoiac is. But in this space, they are seeking out. That is the next thing they do. But when they arrive at the town, they move and they stop doing that, and they now become the town pervert. And the shift between the two, which is the discussion he was having before when we were talking about the earth. And now he's saying this is now basically more of the same, just a different socius, this new socius. That feels close. As I'm doing this, I'm frantically typing in like every other fucking secondary text I have. And aside from a handful of references to BWO, desert's simply not used, which is interesting. So that'll be a thing. I'll dig into that, Ronan. We'll find out. Yeah, my money is it has to do with the location of the first state. We're going to be talking about the Urstadt later. They have a chapter coming up that's talking about the first state and the creation of it and how there has only ever been one state. Therefore, the first state being in the desert in Iraq, where it happened very particularly, kind of a big deal. That'd be my money. But I might be wrong because it's fascinating. But also, we're about to get into a whole bunch of desert fucking, oh my God. I feel like I want to read this because it just, we're going to read this, talk a little bit, and then we'll make our way out.
Maybe before we do that, just
please
to focus on paragraph we just read a little more. Yeah, so the second synthesis, right, is what they're calling out as kind of the difference between the two socii, right? Or how the second synthesis or inscription changes, right? So, like with this, the despot challenges the lateral alliances and the extended affiliations of the old community. So, we were talking about in terms of like, this process of codification, but also of disjunction, um, whereby we have the ambiguous signs and that process of like a sign leaving the chain and going into the partial objects, but a partial object leaving say the group, so to speak, to become part of the chain, right? All of this is shifting so that we're now dealing with a new alliance system where the despotic is in direct affiliation with the deity the people must follow. So like they're going to expand on this, but as they're going through it, like notice how the actual, like the sense of affiliation alliance is being called out as what's shifting here. But at the same time, and I think this, for me at least, this is part of the desert thing, is there's some engagement with what was the earth, right? Because it's become secondary to what's primary in the despotic. The machine of the strange is both a great paranoiac machine, since it expresses the struggle with the old system. So again, notice that engagement. And already a glorious celibate machine, so far as it exalts the triumph of the new alliance. What a time to be alive. So like notice what's being said here, right? In this sense, the despotic acts as a paranoiac machine, right? Or rather, its apparatus is a paranoiac machine. So we're creating exclusive disjunctions, right? At the same time, they're leaning into the third synthesis directly here, and this is very interesting because in this sense, right, the territorialization, the subjectivity is being deployed by that same apparatus, right? So this is going to be, if we're correct about understanding the I in the previous section, this is going to be different than the I because the machine is going to do the I's work here. One is freed oneself. So notice paranoia here is not to be understood through the familialism of paranoia. It's like for me, this is kind of like Klein, where she's kind of thinking about the mother and the father, right? The more we'll say interesting thing is how paranoia, as an exclusive disjunction, as a use of the second synthesis, pertains to the production of terror, right? I would say that's the more critical thing being said there, because paranoia is a type of investment for a social formation. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Just a question here. Is there a correlation between the three kinds of socius with the three forms of synthesis? Or they are each, or that each social socius is, you know, is consists of these three syntheses.
If I follow your question, I would say the three the three syntheses change as the socius changes, right? So the social production, insofar as we're talking about the three syntheses, includes the socius, right? It's part of that binary law's third term, right, which includes the BWO or the socius. So in this sense, right, like the previous socius focused on connection in the first synthesis. The second socius is going to focus even more on the second synthesis, inscription, which, as they're pointing out in this paragraph, right, it's almost a defining characteristic between the primitive and the despotic, right, is how the second synthesis itself changes while also still bearing some engagement with the previous socius in terms of code, right? Same way, like if you're dealing with signifieds, you're still kind of dealing with signifiers, but maybe they're secondary in this regard.
Yeah, thank you.
No problemo.
And we'll actually continue the next paragraph next week, which is a good place to do a break because it's a long one and it's a lot of desert talk. So I'll have time to research and figure out exactly why desert's used here. It'll be lovely. Go for it, JK.
So at what point is Oedipus going to come in?
Well, we've got parts of it, but soon.
Okay, thanks.
It's going to be a defining feature before we move out of this socius.
Yeah, I mean, does it come in during at the second socius, or between the second and the third, or in the third? I mean, is
the rest of the needed parts, except for a minor bit, are coming through here. And that's kind of what this is devised, how they're building this out, is to talk through these machines and the parts of them. Oedipus is foundational to capitalism. So the shift from one to the next is going to be, again, another sea change overall, but it's shifting pieces. More things change, more things stay, the same kind of stuff. And as Oedipus is finally formed, I think they actually have Oedipus at Last is the name of a section. I'm pretty sure that's literally the title of it too. We'll be able to actually really talk through that. It's only 2 or 3 away, I think. And then this book gets really, like, I think sections 3, 9, 10, and 11 will take us 4 months. I mean that. It's literally where we end up spending almost all of our time.
yeah, thanks.
Going back to your question, so it's in the fourth paralogism, right? So like Oedipus is the disfigured image in the fourth paralogism for the primitive. The question raised in the despotic is what places in that kind of trinity Oedipus will take.
I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you guys very much, all of you, for joining us. Next week, we'll continue from here. If you have other questions, don't hesitate to toss them in the chat here or in the AO section down below in our wonderful section for our reading for Anti-Oedipus. We're always keeping an eye on those and always watching. So, but we will see you all next week. Thank you so much.